Talking about security, how the landscape is changing about IT infrastructures and threats.
Well, there's some major transformations that are happening, certainly across the IT landscape, and particularly with things like mobility and cloud. And the implications of that are that we're increasingly faced with securing things we don't directly manage, own, or control. So we have our employees or our customers using their cell phones to connect to services over public networks. They're not even moving across our own infrastructure. And as a result, that creates a unique set of challenges for security and compliance. The other element is that the threat landscape is changing dramatically, not simply getting more sophisticated, because that's always happening, but the nature of attacks are changing so dramatically. The change between a missile coming over a border to espionage are so different that it requires a fundamentally different way of thinking, and that's what's really happening here.
So how security can face these challenges?
Well, so security has to change very fundamentally as well. We have to increasingly focus on managing risk, identifying, understanding risk holistically so that we're placing the investments in the right areas. We need to invest increasingly in visibility and understanding the context behind what's happening inside our environment, as opposed to focusing all of our investment on perimeter controls. And then thirdly, the controls themselves have to change from very sort of static, policy-driven controls to increasingly risk-based and behavior-based controls that can adapt based on the situation, because the attack landscape is so fluid, we simply can't keep up with a very static-oriented approach. But it really is a shift from simply a compliance-oriented model to a model that's based around understanding risk.
There are impediments to this changing.
Yeah, so there's several impediments. One clearly is budget. And the answer is not simply a question of more money. It's about shifting where we're placing our investments, to shift some of our investments from sort of perimeter-oriented controls to more sort of visibility on the inside. Some of it is skill sets. Increasingly, solving this problem is going to require a very different skill set of our security professionals than what we've had in the past. Thirdly, it's going to require the sharing of information between communities of interest, between trusted sources. That's critical to getting ahead of the threat. And lastly, traditionally, it's also been a technological challenge. Solving these kinds of problems requires looking at much larger sets of data and performing more sophisticated analytics, and it's really only quite recently that the technology has caught up to be able to address this. But we do see organizations starting to make this shift, certainly starting with larger organizations and defense industrial base, but increasingly as organizations start moving from compliance mentality to more risk mentality, we see them making these fundamental changes.